They came like shadows creeping in the morning sun, pretending to be something they weren't, and they chose the wrong man to intimidate. James Carter stood quietly on his porch, his coffee steaming in the cool air as he looked over the lake. He had moved here for peace, to get away from the noise of the city and the endless chaos of his job. His neighbors saw him as just another quiet homeowner who liked fishing and keeping to himself. What they didn't know was that James was no ordinary man. He was one of the FBI's most feared agents, a man who had spent years dismantling gangs, taking down drug cartels, and breaking the backs of organized crime. Criminals across multiple states spoke his name in hushed tones, but here, he looked like a man simply enjoying retirement. And maybe that's why the so-called HOA police thought they could target him. The black SUV rolled up slowly, engine humming as four men stepped out. They wore matching black tactical outfits with big white letters that read HOA Police. Their boots stomped on the pavement as they made their way toward James's cabin, their fake authority dripping off them like oil. To anyone else, they might have looked official, but James saw through them immediately. He had seen enough real uniforms, real tactical teams, to recognize a fraud when it walked right up to him. One of them, tall and broad with a shaved head, called out, "You're in violation of HOA Code 19B. We're here to bring you in for questioning." His tone was aggressive, his chest puffed up like he was auditioning for a cop drama. James didn't move. He didn't blink. He just sipped his coffee and set the mug down on the wooden railing. "Bring me in," he said calmly. "And where exactly do you think you're taking me?" The tall one smirked, clearly used to people folding under his bark. "Don't play smart. You've ignored repeated HOA warnings, and now you're facing arrest. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." James tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as he studied the patches on their uniforms. The badges were cheap metal, the kind you could buy online for $20. Their belts looked mismatched, their gear carried like props, not tools. And worst of all was the arrogance in their faces, the assumption that intimidation would be enough. But what struck James the most wasn't the fake authority, it was the way the tall one glanced at his skin, his lips curling with subtle disgust. That glance told James everything. This wasn't just about HOA rules or fake tickets. This was about race. They had picked him because they thought he didn't belong, because his presence in a wealthy, quiet community didn't match their idea of who should live here. The second man, stockier with tattoos peeking from under his sleeves, stepped forward and snapped, "We don't need to explain anything to you. The HOA police have the authority to act, and you've been reported as non-compliant. You don't fit in with the standards here." James's jaw tightened, but his expression remained unreadable. Years of interrogating criminals had taught him that silence can be more powerful than shouting. He let the weight of his quiet stare press down on them until they shifted uncomfortably. Finally, the third man, clearly the nervous one of the group, muttered, "Maybe we should just fine him." But the tall leader cut him off with a wave. "No. People like him need to be taught a lesson. Turn around, now." He pulled out a pair of cheap handcuffs, the kind that bent easily and rattled in his grip. James almost laughed at the absurdity. They really thought they were in control. "Gentlemen," James said slowly, his voice calm and steady, "you might want to think very carefully about what you're doing right now. Because this road you're walking down, it doesn't end the way you think it does." The tall one sneered, mistaking James's calm for weakness. "What are you gonna do? Call your lawyer? Call the cops? We are the cops here." He reached forward, aiming to grab James by the wrist. And that was the last mistake he would make that day. With a move so fast the others barely saw it, James snatched the man's wrist, twisted it back, and slammed him face first against the hood of his own SUV. The man yelped in shock as the cuffs clattered out of his hand. In one fluid motion, James pressed his arm up behind his back, immobilizing him. The other three froze, their fake confidence draining away. This wasn't how their game usually played out. Their victims usually panicked, begged, or offered money to avoid trouble. Nobody fought back. Nobody moved this fast. Nobody looked this dangerous while staying so calm. James leaned close to the pinned man's ear and whispered, "You should have done your homework before you came here." Then louder, so the others could hear. "You just tried to arrest a federal agent." Their eyes widened. "Federal agent?" one of them stammered. James reached into his jacket, pulling out the badge that gleamed in the morning light, the unmistakable gold FBI shield. He held it up with a calm authority that sent chills down their spines. "That's right. Special Agent James Carter. And you're in a lot more trouble than you think." The silence that followed was heavy. The leader squirmed helplessly against the SUV, his face pressed to the metal as James's grip tightened. The other three exchanged nervous glances, realizing the script they'd written for this encounter had just been torn to shreds. For the first time, fear flickered across their faces. They weren't dealing with some helpless homeowner. They weren't dealing with someone they could bully. They were dealing with the man criminals across the state prayed never to meet. And James? He hadn't even broken a sweat. The air was thick with tension as James kept the tall fake officer pinned against the SUV. The other three stood frozen, their fake badges glinting in the morning light, their confidence unraveling with every passing second. They had walked onto his property thinking they were in control, thinking their intimidation tactics would work as they always did. But James Carter wasn't their usual victim. He wasn't some nervous retiree or timid homeowner scared of HOA fees. He was a man who had spent years walking into rooms full of armed gang members and walking out with half of them in handcuffs. Compared to that, these four were amateurs playing dress-up. The stocky one with tattoos tried to recover his nerve. He pulled out a cheap-looking stun baton, flicking it on so it buzzed menacingly. "You think that badge means something to us? You're in our neighborhood now. We make the rules here." His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, betraying the fear that was beginning to spread through him. James didn't flinch. He tightened his grip on the pinned man and spoke in that same calm, steady voice, the kind of voice that had made hardened criminals spill secrets in interrogation rooms. "You're right about one thing, you make rules. Fake ones. And now you're about to find out what happens when you try to enforce those fake rules against the wrong man." The man with the baton rushed forward, swinging it wildly like a rookie who'd only seen combat in video games. James moved with surgical precision. He released the man he had pinned, ducked under the swing, and with a sharp twist, swept the attacker's legs out from under him. The baton flew from his hand as he hit the ground with a thud. Before he could react, James pressed a knee against his chest, snatched the weapon, and tossed it into the bushes. Now two of them were on the ground, groaning in shock and pain. The other two stepped back, their bravado gone. One of them muttered, "What the hell is he?" James stood tall, his eyes cold, his voice calm but deadly serious. "I'm the man who ends your little game. And trust me, you picked the wrong house this morning." The smallest of the group, clearly the follower who had been dragged into this mess, stuttered, "We didn't mean anything by it. We were just trying to keep the neighborhood safe." James laughed once, low and humorless. "Safe? By extorting homeowners? By threatening people with fake laws? By targeting me because of the color of my skin? That's not keeping people safe, that's being a criminal in a cheap uniform." The tall leader, still catching his breath, tried to spit back some control. "You don't know what you're talking about. We've got authority from the HOA. We can do whatever we need to keep this place in line." James stepped closer, looming over him with the weight of real authority, and pulled out his badge again, holding it inches from the man's face. "No. You can't. This badge is real. Mine comes with the full force of federal law behind it. Yours is a piece of tin you ordered online. And now, you're going to answer for every single scam you've pulled in this neighborhood." The leader's eyes darted nervously, calculating whether to fight or flee. His bravado cracked further when James pulled out his phone, dialed a secured number, and spoke with calm authority. "This is Special Agent Carter. I've got 4 suspects on site impersonating law enforcement and attempting unlawful detainment. Send backup immediately." He gave the address, never once taking his piercing gaze off the men. The fake officers panicked. The nervous one whispered, "He's serious, he's really FBI." The tattoos guy groaned on the ground, clutching his ribs, while the leader kept glaring at James like a cornered wolf. James pocketed his phone and folded his arms, standing like an immovable wall. "Here's the part you don't get. You think you're above the law because nobody's challenged you before. You think you can scare people into compliance because you wear costumes and shout like you have authority. But now? You've run into someone who doesn't scare. Someone who's seen worse than you can even imagine. And here's the truth, your little empire ends today." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of a crow cawing in the distance. The fake cops shifted uneasily, suddenly aware of neighbors peeking through curtains, phones recording from porches, eyes witnessing their humiliation. For years they had bullied in the shadows, but today, sunlight had found them. Minutes stretched, but James never let his guard down. He kept the leader restrained, his stance sharp, his eyes locked on the others. Then, far off in the distance, the rising wail of sirens cut through the morning air. The fake cops froze. Their breathing grew heavy, fear thick in their throats. The nervous one whispered, "We should run." James's voice boomed like thunder. "Don't even think about it. The second you move, I'll put you face down on this pavement, and you won't get up again without handcuffs." The leader tried one last desperate attempt at control. "This is harassment. We're just trying to enforce HOA rules." James shook his head slowly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Harassment? You have no idea what word you're trying to use. This is called justice. And you're about to get a front row seat." The sirens grew louder until real law enforcement cruisers roared onto the street, lights flashing red and blue against the calm lakefront houses. Neighbors stepped out fully now, watching the show. 4 sheriff's deputies jumped out, hands on their weapons, but James raised a hand. "Stand down. Situation's under control." The sheriff himself climbed out of one of the cruisers, adjusting his hat as he walked up. He recognized James immediately and let out a low whistle. "Agent Carter. Didn't expect to find you in the middle of all this." James gave a shrug. "Didn't expect trouble this soon after moving in. But I guess trouble doesn't knock, it just barges in wearing fake badges." The sheriff looked over the fake cops and shook his head. "These the ones who've been terrorizing the neighborhood?" "Yeah," James said flatly. "Impersonating officers, extortion, assault, harassment, and targeting residents based on race. Quite the resume." The deputies quickly moved in, cuffing the stunned men with real handcuffs this time. Their fake patches and badges were stripped off as evidence. The neighbors clapped softly from the sidewalks, murmurs spreading like wildfire. For the first time, people saw the so-called HOA police exposed for what they really were, cowards hiding behind costumes. James stepped back, folding his arms, watching as the men were loaded into the back of the cruisers. His voice dropped low, almost to himself, but loud enough for the neighbors nearby to hear. "And that's the thing about bullies. They always think they've found an easy target. Until the day they choose wrong." The sheriff gave him a nod of respect. "Glad you were here, Agent Carter. Saved us a lot of trouble." James didn't smile. He simply lifted his coffee mug from the porch railing, still half full, and took a sip as though nothing had happened. The scene around him, flashing lights, humiliated criminals, whispering neighbors, was just another day for him. But for the HOA fakes, it was the end of their reign. Because when you try to arrest the most feared FBI agent, you don't just fail, you lose everything. The neighborhood was buzzing by the afternoon, the kind of buzz that spreads when something big happens in a small, quiet community. Word had traveled faster than wildfire. Everyone had either seen the scene unfold with their own eyes, peeked through their blinds, or heard the retelling from the neighbor across the street. People who had once been terrified of the so-called HOA police were now talking loudly about them, sharing stories of how they had been threatened, fined, or harassed. But the difference today was that those stories no longer carried fear, they carried relief, even laughter. For the first time, the predators had been exposed, and it was thanks to the man who had just moved in, James Carter. James, however, wasn't basking in the attention. He sat in his living room with the blinds half open, sipping on a fresh cup of coffee. He had seen this reaction before, the shocked awe of regular people realizing someone had stood up to the bullies they thought were untouchable. But James wasn't interested in being a hero to his neighbors. He had come here for peace, for quiet mornings on the porch and long walks by the lake. Yet trouble always had a way of finding him, and once again, his name was in the spotlight. Across the street, a young couple, Sarah and Tom, were on their porch whispering. "That's him," Sarah said, pointing discreetly. "That's the guy who stopped them." Tom nodded, his eyes wide. "I heard he's FBI. Like, the real deal. My cousin texted me a link, there's already a video of it online." And sure enough, within hours, videos recorded by neighbors were flooding social media. One clip showed James twisting the leader's arm and pinning him against the SUV, while another caught the exact moment he flashed his FBI badge. The captions were brutal: "Fake HOA police try to arrest black man, he's an FBI agent." Another read, "HOA bullies humiliated by real law enforcement." The views skyrocketed, shares multiplied, and by evening, the story was on local news broadcasts. James's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He glanced at it, an encrypted FBI line. He picked up, his voice calm. "Carter." "Agent Carter," came the voice of his supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Martinez. "I just watched the footage. You never really take a vacation, do you?" James smirked slightly. "Didn't plan for this. They came to me." Martinez chuckled. "Well, you handled it. But now the Bureau's getting calls from the media, local politicians, even civil rights groups. People want statements, they want confirmation. You've become the face of this story." "I didn't ask for that," James replied firmly. "I know you didn't. But this is bigger than you now. Those men weren't just playing cops, they were targeting people based on race. You know how important that is to expose. The Bureau wants you to stay on this, at least until the investigation is complete." James sighed, leaning back in his chair. "So much for peace and quiet." "Understood." After hanging up, he stepped back outside, where more neighbors had gathered. They looked at him differently now, not with suspicion like some had when he first moved in, but with gratitude and respect. An older man named Harold, who lived 2 houses down, shuffled over with a cane. "Mr. Carter," he said softly, "I've lived here 20 years. Those thugs came to my house last spring. Said my fence was out of compliance. They fined me $300. I didn't know what else to do, so I paid. Turns out they were frauds the whole time." His voice shook with anger. "You don't know how good it feels to see them taken down." James put a hand on Harold's shoulder. "You don't owe me thanks. What they did was criminal, and they won't be doing it again." More neighbors joined, sharing their own stories. A single mother admitted they had threatened to tow her car if she didn't donate to the HOA fund. Another family revealed they'd been told their teenage son couldn't walk home after dark or he'd be arrested. Every story painted the same picture: years of bullying under the false flag of authority. As James listened, he realized this wasn't just a group of 4 con men. This was a pattern. They had been allowed to operate because the Real HOA board either ignored it or quietly benefited from it. And James knew corruption when he saw it. He could smell it a mile away. By the next morning, the story had gone national. Major news networks replayed the videos, with anchors praising James's composure and courage. Hashtags like #FakeHOAPolice and #Agent Carter trended online. Civil rights activists called for investigations into how such scams could exist in the first place. And James? He stayed quiet, refusing to give interviews. He didn't care about fame, he cared about justice. At the sheriff's department, the arrested men were being interrogated. James sat behind the glass of the observation room, arms folded, as detectives questioned the leader. The man tried to put on his tough act again, but under pressure, cracks began to show. He admitted that they had been hired muscle for certain board members who wanted strict control of the neighborhood. The fake uniforms had been paid for with HOA funds. And the orders? Target certain residents to scare them into paying fines or leaving altogether. James's jaw tightened. It wasn't just a scam. It was a racket with possible ties to racial discrimination. This wasn't about lawn care or property values, it was about power, greed, and control. When the interrogation was over, the sheriff turned to James. "Looks like your new neighbors have a lot more to answer for than just harassment." James nodded. "And we're going to find out just how deep this goes." Back in the neighborhood, whispers continued to grow. People began holding impromptu meetings, demanding answers from the HOA board. Some board members avoided public appearances altogether, while others stammered excuses about not knowing what the fake cops had been doing. But nobody believed them anymore. For the first time, the residents weren't afraid to ask questions. And the reason was simple: they knew James Carter was living among them, and he wasn't afraid of anyone. That night, as James sat on his porch with the lake shimmering under the moonlight, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a neighbor's text: "Thank you. Because of you, we finally feel safe here." James stared at the message for a long moment. He hadn't moved here to be a protector or a symbol. He'd wanted peace, anonymity. But maybe peace didn't mean hiding from conflict. Maybe peace meant ending it so it couldn't touch him, or anyone else, again. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The fake HOA police were just the tip of the iceberg. The real fight was coming, and as always, James Carter would be ready. The HOA board meeting was supposed to be routine, just another dull evening where a handful of members sat at folding tables, flipping through papers, and dictating rules about lawn heights and mailbox paint colors. But that night, the atmosphere was different. The small community center was packed with angry residents, their voices echoing off the walls as they demanded answers. Some clutched cell phones with the viral videos playing on loop, others held up fake HOA police patches that neighbors had found discarded on the ground. Every eye in the room burned with the same question: how had this been allowed to happen? The board members sat nervously at the front, faces pale, papers trembling in their hands. They weren't used to this. For years they had operated with near total control, waving around their rules and fines like weapons. Now they were cornered, and they knew it. The room went silent when James Carter walked in. He didn't stride in with swagger or arrogance. He just walked calmly, deliberately, his FBI badge clipped to his belt, his presence commanding without effort. Conversations hushed, chairs scraped as people turned to look, and even the board members seemed to shrink into their seats. James wasn't here to play politics or to listen to excuses. He was here to end this. He took a seat in the front row, folding his arms across his chest as the board president, a man named Gregory Hale, cleared his throat nervously. Thank you all for attending. We want to begin by saying how shocked and saddened we are by the actions of the individuals impersonating law enforcement. The board had no knowledge of their crimes, and we are cooperating fully with authorities. Lies, a woman shouted from the back. The crowd erupted, voices rising with anger. You hired them, another man yelled. You knew exactly what they were doing. Gregory raised his hands, his voice shaky. Please, let's maintain order. James stood up slowly, and the room immediately quieted. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was low, steady, but it carried across the entire hall like thunder. Order isn't the problem here. The problem is corruption. The problem is that this board either allowed or directly enabled criminals to operate in this neighborhood under the disguise of authority. And the people here are done with your excuses. Gregory's face went red. You can't just accuse us without proof. James reached into his jacket and pulled out a small stack of papers. He laid them on the table in front of the board, each one stamped with the FBI seal. Proof? I've got recorded statements from the men you hired. I've got receipts for equipment purchased with HOA funds. I've got testimony from residents who were extorted under your watch. That's not speculation, that's evidence. The board members exchanged panicked glances. One of them, a woman with sharp glasses, stammered, We didn't know they would take things that far. We just wanted compliance. Compliance? James cut her off, his eyes narrowing. You call it compliance when families are threatened in their own homes? When elderly residents are forced to hand over money out of fear? When people of color are singled out and told they don't belong? That's not compliance. That's criminal abuse. The crowd murmured in agreement, some shouting, yes, and, that's right. James stepped closer to the table, his presence looming over the board members. Let me make this clear. I'm not here as your neighbor tonight. I'm here as a federal agent. And from this moment on, this community isn't going to be ruled by bullies in cheap uniforms or by a corrupt board that looks the other way. Gregory tried to muster some of his old arrogance, puffing up his chest. You can't come in here and take over our HOA. We have bylaws, we have authority. James leaned in, his voice dropping so low the microphone on the table barely picked it up, but every word hit like a hammer. Your authority ends where the law begins. And right now, the FBI is investigating this board for fraud, conspiracy, and possible civil rights violations. If you think those bylaws will protect you, think again. Because when federal charges are filed, you'll be answering to a judge, not to your neighbors. The color drained from Gregory's face. The other board members fidgeted, one even looking like she might cry. The residents, on the other hand, erupted into applause. For the first time, they felt like someone was truly standing up for them. James waited for the noise to die down before continuing. But this isn't just about punishment. It's about change. This community deserves better. Starting tonight, there will be transparency. No more secret fines. No more intimidation. No more hiding behind fake rules. If you want to keep your positions, you'll work with residents openly, fairly, and legally. If you don't, the FBI will make sure you face the consequences of your actions. Those are your only options. The board sat in stunned silence, trapped between resignation and fear. The residents, emboldened by James's words, began shouting demands of their own, calls for new elections, audits of finances, the removal of corrupt members. The balance of power had shifted in a single night, and there was no going back. Later, as the meeting broke up and neighbors gathered around him, thanking him, shaking his hand, James slipped outside. He wasn't one for applause or praise. He leaned against the railing outside the hall, looking up at the stars above the quiet lake. He wanted peace, but he also knew that sometimes peace had to be earned. And tonight, he had given these people the first real taste of it in years. As he walked back to his cabin, phone in hand, a message buzzed through from his supervisor. Good work. Keep your guard up. Something tells me this isn't over. James smirked faintly. He knew Martinez was right. Corruption never ended neatly, it had roots, and those roots could stretch far beyond a neighborhood HOA. But for tonight, at least, the residents could sleep without fear of a knock on the door from fake cops in fake uniforms. For tonight, the lake was calm, the streets were quiet, and justice had been served. He sat on his porch again, the moonlight reflecting off the water, and raised his coffee mug in a quiet toast to the night. To peace, he muttered softly. And though he knew more battles lay ahead, one thing was certain: anyone foolish enough to come after James Carter would quickly learn the same lesson the fake HOA police had learned: some men don't scare, and some men don't bow. And if you try to take down the most feared FBI agent in the region, you don't just lose. You destroy yourself.